Hello, welcome to this revision PowerPoint on, can you guess what it is yet? Anglo-Saxon, England and the Norman Conquest 1060 to 66. It's the first unit out of 3 of the Anglo-Saxon and Normans. And we shall start off with life in Anglo-Saxon England. If you don't understand any of those words, well, there's a definition. So this golden thread is society, to find out about what society was like in Anglo-Saxon England before the Normans so rudely arrived. Here is a timeline of the important things that happened. So again, freeze this screen, take a photo, screenshot it, whatever you want if you haven't got this already. And you can see that it actually starts a little bit before our course starts, but does end in the right place, 1088, when the Norman conquest is over and William has died. Okay, Anglo-Saxon England was split up into earldoms, Wessex being the most powerful, if not the biggest, and then the others, Mercia, where we are, Northumbria, East Anglia, and Kent, with a little bit of Wales and Cornwall and Scotland in the mix. But also importantly is this dotted line of the Danelaw, above which were areas where the Vikings had settled and had Viking ancestors. They were loyal to the king, but they had slightly different customs, and they wanted people to rule them in their earldoms who were like them, the ancestors of Danes. They were all pretty much Christian by this point, though there was not really a difference in religion. Although there may have been one or two still following the old gods. And society was divided, both in the Danelaw and below it, into castes or classes, groups in hierarchical order. The king at the top and slaves at the bottom. And in between, you had the earls. There was an earl for each of these earldoms. So 5 or 6. Then beneath them you had thanes, which were noble, but there were plenty more of those within the earldoms, loyal to both their earl and then the king. Then you had churls, who were free men who worked the farms, but they worked their own farms, and they didn't have to provide service or labour for their thanes or their earls, but they did have to serve in the fyrd if they were needed. Below them are the peasants, which was most people, and they did have to provide work for their lords up to 3 days, and they had time on the other days to grow their own land and pay their rent with what they grew. And again, they could be asked to fight for the fyrd. Then you've got slaves who were not free, had no land, and they worked for the lord, and they could potentially buy their freedom, or they could sell themselves into slavery in the first place if they wanted to raise some money. But once they were a slave, they had very little choice over what they did with their lives. So that's how it looks, and it's a pyramid shape, triangle shape, because there's only one king, then there's 6 earls, a few hundred thanes, possibly 1,000, many more churls, even more, I've said 70%, peasants, and slaves, a little bit of a slightly wrong shape there. I suppose it should be a Christmas tree, shouldn't it, with a little bit of slaves at the bottom. So that's just the same structure of society. You could potentially move up and down, more so than when the Normans came along. Like I said, peasants could sell themselves into slavery and slaves could get their freedom. and peasants could become a churl or a thane, and a thane could become an earl. And as we see, Harold Godwinson was an earl that became a king. There's a pie chart. Is it a pie chart if there's a hole in the middle, or is it a donut chart? But showing you like the vast majority are peasants, and there's a few slaves, but most people are peasants, and there's a tiny fraction of nobles. So if you got a question at the start on the features of Anglo-Saxon England, you could talk about that, the amount of people who were slaves. You could talk about what they had to do for their masters. You could talk about the fact that they could move up and down it in some cases, but you would need, as always, one feature and then a supporting argument, which is hence the dots. You needed to put the extra in there to get the 2 marks there, and then a different feature. The second one can't be too close to feature one, otherwise you won't get the marks. And again, 2 sentences for that. So you get the full 4 marks. You've got 2 for feature 1 and 2 for feature 2. So let's start at the top. The king had obviously the most power. Things like controlling the production of money, raising an army, asking for tax, and people had to obey the law that he set, etc., etc. That's just a little bit more of a graphical representation of what we just looked at. The other one that's added there is religion, because the king was chosen by God. That gave him the basis of his power. Now, Edward, the Confessor, who is king when we start our course, was a very religious leader, hence the name Confessor, because he confessed his sins. He didn't fight. He wasn't a strong army leader, but he relied upon his earls to do that for him, particularly Earl Godwin and his sons. Despite not being a great warrior, he was a respected king because he made good laws and kept things peaceful, and because of his piety, his religiousness. However, unlike William, who was, when he conquered, was very, very powerful and had almost no limits to his monarchy, the Anglo-Saxon kings did. They had, as you mentioned, the Danelaw, that meant that he wasn't automatically guaranteed their support, even though most of them did support him. And he's also got the earls who had accrued the most power, namely Godwin, who was in charge of Wessex, and then his family took over much of the rest of the kingdom in terms of earldoms. And because they had their own armies, it did mean that Edward had a bit of a threat there. Now, Edward and Godwin had fallen out in the years before 1050 because King Edward had told Godwin to punish people of Dover who had attacked a visitor, an important visitor, and Godwin had refused to do that. So Godwin was forced into exile, and Godwin returned with an army, which meant that Edward had to pretty much let him back in. So that demonstrates limits to Edward's power. The other limit you could talk about, if you got a question on this, was the Witan. Now, the Witan is not a parliament. It's his earls and whoever he wants, essentially. If he wants to call all the thanes, he could do, or that would be quite unusual because there's so many of them. But he could call the ones in the local area that he wanted, or specific ones, and they would discuss and advise him on various things like threats from foreign powers, religion, and land disputes. The Witans importance also stretched to when the king died, the Witan chose and approved the next king, which could well be the son of the king if there was one. But as we see in 1066, there wasn't an obvious choice, so the Witan became even more important there for that short period of time in choosing, as it turned out to be, Harold Godwinson. Now, the king, when he was alive, did not have to follow what the Witan said. They had no executive power in that sense. However, they had influence. And obviously, he knew when he died, they would choose the next king. So there was some advantage to keeping the Witan and the earls and things within it happy. So when you had a strong king, the earls were less powerful. That probably goes without saying. However, Edward was not that sort of king. He was respected, but he was not strong and feared. The other way of looking at it, though, is that the earls couldn't overplay their hand too, because there were times when thanes were removed for being too uppity, and the famous example that you need to know that is Earl Tostig, the son of Godwinson, who was forced into exile from Northumbria. All right, there's a summary there if you want to have a quick look, but I'm moving on to how Anglo-Saxon England was governed. So we've seen the earldoms. Within the earldoms, there are shires, which are the basis of our counties today. In fact, county is just the French word for shire, really, which is why they're called shires, but they've got county in there. Well, why we call them counties. In some cases, it is like County Durham. So we got a local government in each of the counties, for example, courts and shire reeves, burghs, the county towns, of which we have in Shropshire is Shrewsbury, and the word bury comes from that word burgh. And you've got the third that was taken from the churls and the peasants from each county, each shire. So in the shires, there were subdivisions even further of hundreds, which there wasn't 100. It was that there were about 100 households. So there would probably be less than 100 hundreds in counties, if you know what I mean. And then the hundreds were subdivided further into tithing. So it's actually quite a metric system, which is unusual because most of the measurements those days were not based on tens and hundreds. And then within the tithings, you had a hide, which is 1 bit of land that a family could farm. And looking over all of those is the shire reeves, which became known as sheriffs because it's a contraction of that word or those words. And they collected tax and revenues, fines, made sure people obeyed the law in the courts. They sorted out the third, and they were responsible for roads and fortifications. And the king sent out orders to these written down instructions called writs, which were sealed in wax and stamped by the king's ring. So that's what a burgh would look like back in the days. Wooden walls, maybe a ditch or a moat, roads going through them, different gates at the entrances, and they were market towns where you would take your food or your animals to sell. The third is the part-time army made up of the churls and the peasants, and there were 2 sorts of third. One, the select third, which was the good one, which they had to go and fight wherever the king wanted to in England. So they're the ones who would travel up to Northumbria from London when Harold Hardrada invaded. And then you've got the general third, who are used on a more local basis, and they wouldn't leave their shire. So the select third had thanes in it as as well. So they were better trained and still not as well trained as the housecarls, which we'll get onto, but better trained and better equipped. But they had to come back home after 40 days, which again is why when William invaded after Harold Godwinson had beat Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, some of them had to go back home because they had done their 40 days. So that's military or law. The king made the law. We know that he made the law however he wanted to. He could have asked the Witan for advice, but he didn't have to follow it. So he was also expected to settle arguments and give justice out. Now, there are a couple of interesting ways of dealing with crime. Blood feuds, which in Saxon times meant if somebody had killed a member of your family, then you would punish that person, possibly by killing them, and then they would do the same back to you. And you can see how that would be a problem of revenge upon revenge. And a feud is when you've got two families at war with each other, essentially, over a long period of time. So what the Saxons came up with was this idea of weregild, where the family who had lost a member, they would essentially fine the murderer's family, who had to pay this money, and you then didn't have these blood feuds where people were getting killed left, right, and centre happening. And if you were a thane, you got 1,200 shillings. If you're a peasant, it was only 20, but if you're an earl or an archbishop, it was 3,600 shillings. And so, there's a bit of a comparison to today's money there as well. Now, another thing that they did is ensure that there was collective responsibility. So if a crime was committed, everybody in the tithing, remember 10 households, had to hunt for the criminals, and they would call this the hue and cry. So the cry might go up, follow him, catch him, whatever. And therefore, they would have to hunt the man down, and say man, could be woman, and then bring him to justice. And if someone had done something wrong, this is the collective stuff, they all had to pay a fine in their tithing. So it was upon them to make sure that everybody behaved, because otherwise they would be fined too. Okay, economy. So we've had the military, law and justice, the economy. Anglo-Saxon England was rich. That's why the Vikings kept on trying to invade and nick stuff, or even settle here. Partly, well, mainly really because of the fertile farmland. Say what you want about the English weather, but there's enough sun to make stuff grow and a hell of a lot of rain to water the plants. So, and the soil is good compared to other regions as well. So that meant that there was loads of crops and loads of animals living on the crops. A lot of that was traded, and a lot of other materials and goods were traded abroad, particularly with France and the Normans and other northern European nations. The tax system that the king had set up meant that people were rich, particularly at the top, and there was a central controlling share of money and trading in the bourse. Anything else in here? Yeah, London and York were the two big cities, but Norwich and Lincoln were also relatively large. Silvers used coins. The fact that Anglo-Saxons drank wine must have shown that there was trade between England and Normandy, because it's not really warm enough to grow grapes and make wine in England, so they must have bought it from France. And then wool was what we exported the most from sheepsies. So if you got two features, the social system of Anglo-Saxon England, you would need to tell me something maybe about the law and the weregild. And you could then say the weregild was paid if somebody committed a murder. It depended on how important you were as how much you got. For example, it was only 20 shillings if you were a peasant, that sort of stuff. And different one, feature two, you could say something like Anglo-Saxon England was divided into shires, and then that was subdivided into hundreds of 100 households and tithes of 10 households, each one having each household having a hide, which is a piece of land big enough for one family to farm. That would be actually probably too much, but you've definitely got the fault marks there. So how was it governed? Continued, but this time church, because they had a role to play too. It was rich, it was powerful because they got taxes and they oversaw everyday life in all the different villages and towns. There were two equally important. It's important for later because one of them becomes the most important. Spoiler alert, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury, but the Archbishop of York in Saxon times was just as important. And they then had archbishops, 15 bishops in their different dioceses, which were similar to the shires, or I suppose slightly smaller than earldoms, if there's 15 of them. These dioceses are different, they're different areas, and there's one area that a bishop controls. Then you've got monasteries, which make up the religious monk orders, with nuns as well, female versions of monks. And overall, it owned 25% of the land, which made it very powerful and very rich, and also got to send bishops and archbishops to the Witan and advise the king. Everybody believed in heaven and hell, and they believed that they would go to one or the other. So that was some sort of power that the church had as well, to make people behave the way they wanted them to. So people prayed a lot. They had days off for the holy days or holidays. So they would be thankful for the church as well. And when I say church, just remember, I don't mean just the buildings. The church is the building itself, but it's also everybody and everything within it. Just like the school can mean the building, I went into the school, but it also can mean the school as in the school community. So anything else there? Not really. It's all pretty much the same. Bit of information that local groups were not particularly well educated and could not read the language used by the church, and they did get married at this point. Okay. On to the House of Godwin. This is about power, because they had a lot of power. So we've got Godwin himself, who's not on there, but because he dies by 1055. And that's before even this unit starts, but his offspring are many and powerful. Godwinson's most famous, Tostig's second, then you've got Gurth and Leofwine, and then you've got people who weren't directly related to Godwin, but often married into the family, and people who, knew him, like William. So the House of Godwin started in Canute's reign, when Godwin was made Earl of Wessex. And Godwin, despite Canute being a Viking, was probably himself the son of an Anglo-Saxon thane. And then the Godwins amassed power by family connections and marrying people. And Godwin himself had helped Edward become king, despite the later falling out. And then the king married Edith of Wessex, who was a Godwin too. You can see a little bit of the family tree there. And there's another one coming up. You can see that Edith, the sister of Harold, who was Harold Godwinson, was married to King Edward, which means they are brothers-in-law. There's an even more extended family tree. You can see how many kids they had. Oh, there's loads. 9. And you can see there's a lot of Ediths there, because Harold had 2 wives, both called Edith, and his sister was also called Edith. Come on, Saxons, you're not making it easy for us, are you? So you can see that the Godwins are the most powerful family, and they rivaled even the king's power. They had the wealth. They had lots of thanes that were loyal to them, and the thanes were warriors, so they had a huge army that they had to provide to the king if he wanted to, but they could, if they chose to, use it against the king, I suppose. They were influential in the church. They were well connected by marriages, including the one of the king, and they were in charge of Wessex, which meant that they were responsible for defending the south of England, which is where the king lived. So they were £6,000 per year. No, sorry, the king's land was £6,000 per year, and Godwinson's had more than that, so they were richer than the king. And they'd even helped fight against Wales for Harold when he was having problems with the Welsh king. And like we said, Harold Godwinson had had two marriages, one to Edith Swanneck and one as an alliance, political alliance, when he became king, to Edith the Fair, the sister of Morcar, and also Edwin, because they were brothers, who were the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia. So again, showing you how the marriages increased their power. So 1053, I said 1055, didn't I? 1053 is when when Godwin died, and Godwinson took over. And then 1055 is when Tostig became the new Earl of Northumbria. Now he is not a Dane and not related to a Dane, so that meant that the Danes in the Danelaw, or the ancestors of the Vikings, were not particularly happy with that. Gurth got East Anglia, and a small, tiny earldom was given to Leofwine. So they were becoming incredibly powerful. Edward had no choice to allow it, really. He was related. He was in the club. They were under threat from Norway, as per usual with the Vikings. So having Tostig in the Earl of Northumbria gave him a strong power base up there. And whereas Harold defends the south coast, Tostig can now defend the north east coast. And then Harold marrying the sister of Morcar and Edwin also meant that he had become more powerful, and Edward didn't really have much choice, to be honest. And we've also seen that he wasn't particularly happy about it. He did try to exile Godwin, but that failed. Example I've already told you about. Godwin's sons being good warriors, Harold Godwinson himself fighting against the King of Wales, and Tostig helping him over the land whilst Harold went by a ship, and that was a huge success. So it's not surprising that in 1064, possibly 65, Harold being the second most important person as the eldest Godwin now, and the Earl of the strongest earldom, was sent to France, to Normandy. Just give me a second. I've got to let the dog in to have a drink. Sorry about that. So, why he was sent is up for debate, but he did, and he was actually blown off course in his ship and was taken prisoner by this guy called Count Guy, although the French would pronounce it Guy. William, I'll tell you the story via the Bayeux Tapestry, actually, which is where we get a lot of our information about the Norman Conquest. And that's what it looks like. So it used to look like. That's another bit of it. That's the whole thing. And there's a close-up of this guy, or Guy, taking Harold prisoner. Again, arrow's a bit in the wrong place. If only that had been the same for Harold later, eh? History jokes. Well, so that's when he became blown off course. Obviously Harold's probably thinking at this moment, "Oh, Jesus, Mary and the wee donkey, what's going to happen to me?" And he's taken to William. There he is, and there's William. Now, William is in a strong position. He's got a nobleman worth thousands of pounds, as we already saw, in his command. He's going to ask for a ransom, but whilst that ransom is being collected, he takes him to a battle, as you do with your prisoner, because he respects him as another nobleman. And obviously, Harold had fought well because on the Bayeux Tapestry, which is biased towards William and not Harold, here's Harold getting a reward, weapons and armor from William. So apparently, Harold even saved some of William's men from drowning. I'm going to let the dog out again. What goes in must come out, so I'll probably have to let him out for a wee in a second. So he may have even knighted Harold after saved some of his William's men from drowning. Anyway, the last thing he did before he let him go is he thought, aha, I have this man who's the strongest earl and the second most strongest man in England. He is potentially going to take over from Edward when Edward dies, but I want to take over from Edward. So what if I get him to say that he's not going to take over from Edward and I can take over from Edward? Then I can take over from Edward and he won't take over from Edward. How can I do that? The relics. Good idea. Make him swear a holy oath on the relics so that God is paying particular attention, with the people watching on as witnesses, and Harold saying, "Yes, I promise to let you become king when Edward dies." Apparently, William had already been promised by the king earlier, much earlier, possibly when Godwin had been exiled, that he could become king. So he's just cementing his position. So William's like 100% sure now, I'm definitely going to become king. I've got the king saying it. I've got the strongest man in England, right? So it's nailed on, right? Wrong. Anyway, there's some bones of saints that are in the box. And at this point, William's going, yes, in the bag. And Hal's going, but I wanted to become king. How am I going to get out of this fix? Maybe he even had his fingers crossed. I don't know. So the embassy is not really entirely clear as to why he went. It might have been that he was sent over to reaffirm that William was going to become king. That's what the Normans said, but that's what they would say, isn't it? Some people, the Saxons, say that William had already got hostages, a couple of Harold's relatives, and he wasn't able to get them back. Anyway, all it does definitely show is that Harold was King Edward's top guy, his most trusted advisor. And we also know that it was used as propaganda to say why William should be king. And also that Harold was a bad, bad man for breaking that oath. There's some more information there as to what Harold was up to. I'll crack on, because the next thing that happens in 1065 before Edward dies is Tostig has a rebellion against him. And so, for example, if you get a question on this, it might be a 12-mark question where you have to explain 3 reasons why there was a rising against Earl Tostig. And the first reason that we've already discussed is the Danes in the Danelaw didn't want a Saxon telling them what to do. They're fine with the king doing that, but on their patch, they wanted a Dane, or the ancestral Viking. There's also the fact that he was friends with King Malcolm of Scotland, and therefore he let raids come from Scotland into Northumbria, which a proper Earl of Northumbria would not do. And he introduced new laws, southern laws, got rid of his rivals, falsely accused people, ordered the assassination of Northumbrian rivals, and when people complained, he got them killed too. taxing people a lot, which the Danes weren't used to. And even though he did get rid of bandits, he blackmailed his enemies by saying he falsely accused them of being bandits if they didn't pay up. So he wasn't a great guy, all in all, is old Tosti. And so they rose up against him for those reasons. Scottish friendship, unfair, assassination, southern attacks, blackmail. Now, obviously, if you that question that we saw a little bit earlier, you wouldn't have to do 6 paragraphs. There's only 3 needed for a 12-mark question because. But you could put some of those two together, couldn't you? You could put, him being unfair and blackmailing and assassinations together, and you could put, the fact that he's not a true Northumbrian, allowing people, Scots, to attack them, and because he was a southerner and brought in things like taxes from the south. You could think of 3 paragraphs there which included all of those things. So the Northumbrians, they rose up against him, and it's just the same thing. The king down south had to make a decision. He really wanted to crush the rebels and sent Harold up there to do that and help Tostig out. But Harold actually met the rebels, agreed to their demands, and agreed to kick Tostig out, his own brother. Whoa! Then let Morcar be the new earl, and this is before he'd even married Morcar's sister. So there you go. It's he married Morcar's sister to seal this deal between them, but this is before. So maybe Harold thought that Tostig was not a good ruler of Northumbria. He thought that he was going to be the next king, and he didn't really want problems for when he was king, so he dealt with it before he was king. Tostig obviously not happy, accused Harold of plotting against him, and it was all Harold's. This rising was Harold's doing, not the Northumbrians. And then, because Harold didn't do what Edward wanted, that was again a demonstration of his power. And because his strongest earl didn't do what he wanted, he couldn't do anything about it because he's not a particularly strong leader of a king. And by this point, he was old and ill and died 3 months after this. So that factored into the fact that Edward didn't deal with it in a strong way, and also it shows maybe why Harold was getting rid of Tostig. Maybe even Tostig was plotting to become king. We know he was willing to do anything because he sided with Harold Hardrada. So maybe he was even, as second oldest brother, planning to usurp Harold there. Who knows? But the fact that they were brothers didn't seem to mean that there was any love between them. So when Edward did die on the 5th of January 1066, who would become the king? Well, we know, don't we, with Harold? But it was normally, if it could be, it was a relative of the king, the closest relative, who was strong enough really to become king, and that person was known as the Etheling. In this case, the Etheling was a 14-year-old boy. So the Witan actually decided that he wasn't strong enough to defend the realm and was not strong enough to demand loyalty from the Thanes and the Earls, particularly Harold and his family. So these 4 people were the choice for the Witan. Edgar, who was a nephew of the king, only one who's related by blood, but too young. Although he doesn't really look young, does he? To be fair, he was only 14. And then the other 3, which we'll go through. So you need to know is what their claim was, how strong it was, and how likely they were to succeed. So here is the information. Godwinson, he's English. He's the strongest English person. He is a very good fighter. He is related to the king, or was related to the king. Apparently, on his deathbed, Edward, according to Harold anyway, had said that he should be king, and therefore that's why the Witan chose him. Edgar only real plus is that he was related. Teenagers had become kings before they could have advisors and regents or helpers, but what's the point when you've got other men who could do the job just as well or even better? Particularly when there's all these threats from other countries. Then you've got Hardrada, who was the Norwegian king and was related to King Canute. And apparently Canute had promised his father that he could become king, and then he hadn't because Edward had. So he thought that now was a good time to take back what his father had been promised. He was also a very good fighter. Hard Rada means hard ruler. And then we've got William of Normandy. By the way, these are AI, as you haven't guessed, representations of the claimants. Nobody really knows what they look like. There's some descriptions and there's a bit of tapestry, but these are representations of what they might have looked like. Duke of Normandy apparently been promised by William to be king in 1051 when Godwin was exiled, but then when Godwin came back, then Saxons would say that probably he retracted that, and then obviously we got Harold promising William that he could be king in the embassy. So we know that Harold was well aware that William wanted to become king and had a decent claim, particularly strengthened by the Pope. Although Harold and the Witend did not agree that he had that support. And again, a very good warrior because the Normans are actually descended from Vikings. Because of all that complication, the Witan decided to crown Harold the very next day after Edward died. And so on the same day as his funeral, essentially, William was fuming. And Harold had got that problem, but also other Saxon earls, although they were in the Witan, so they probably agreed that he should be king. Northumbria, they didn't like Tostig. Maybe they wouldn't want Harold, although Harold had agreed to their aims there. Tostig himself was still alive. Harold hadn't killed him, he just exiled him, and he was roaming around Europe looking for somebody to help him get back. And then obviously William of Normandy. So Harold goes to York to talk with the Northumbrians, who are the biggest problem within his own country, and got their support. He then got the third together and put them on the south coast because William was the obvious one to defend against. And Tostig then sailed over to England, saw the defences and left again. Went to Scotland and then went to Norway, which is where he met up with Hardrada. More about that in a bit. So the third were on the southern coast for the whole of the summer waiting for William, but the wind was in the wrong direction. And the invasion from William never came. But the invasion from the north certainly did. And here's a map. You're going to see a few maps. So that's the dotted line is the Saxon, the Viking invasion, and then Godwinson going up from London and then coming back down. So that's a tapestry of William and his men chopping down trees to make boats. That's the 10,000 Viking soldiers sailing over to the north of England. And this is my map that I made of Harold Hardrada's Blue Crown sailing over, landing in Northumbria, and Harold Godwinson, who is the Yellow Crown, marching 180 miles up to meet him, at which point they'd already had a battle because the new Earl of Northumbria Morcar, who'd taken over from Tostig, and his brother Edwin of Mercia had tried to fight Harold Hardrada and they had lost. The Earls Edwin and Morcar had chosen this position next to a brook or a ford, and they'd got a river on one side and marshlands on the other side, meaning that they were protected. But Hardrada won anyway, despite the Saxons having the advantage, pushing the troops into the marshland. Hardrada had got a secret bit of troops in the wings, outflanking the Saxons using an old Roman road which crossed the marsh, and then got round the back of the earls and killed most of the Northumbrian and Mercian third and housecarls. So then Hardrada, who is backed by Tostig, then go to York, which surrendered to the army, the Viking army, maybe like happily, to be honest, because he was a Viking. And they promised to help him against King Harold. Then Hardrada goes back to his camp and has taken some hostages from York, but is expecting some more, giving them to Harold Hardrada at the camp. So another question you might get is explain why Harold Hardrada was successful at the Battle of Cape Fulford. If you want any more information on that, you can type that link in. So Stamford Bridge is the second battle, as Harold Hardrada is waiting for the hostages to be given over to him from York. The troops are waiting, knowing that Harold Godwinson is going to be marching north as he's found out about Fulford and the invasion. But they weren't expecting him so quickly, so they are sat on one side of this bridge at Stamford Bridge without most of their armour. The Saxons marched incredibly quickly, took 5 days to get north, and took the Vikings by surprise, killed quite a lot of them until the berserker on the bridge took a lot of the Saxon army out. Eventually, the Saxons stab him up the bum from below in a boat, and then flooded over the bridge, killed the Vikings who had not got time to get back to their ships to get their armor, and Hardrada and Tostig were both killed. So if you want to pause this and put them in the right order, that'll give you an idea of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. And here are some questions that you might get. Why was Harold Godwinson victorious at the Battle of Stamford Bridge? And you can use this to plan your answer. Again, it's a 12-mark question. There's 3 reasons, and each reason should have a point evidence explain link. Or you could even have the battles in the north together, Fulford and Stamford Bridge were a decisive mistake for Harold Godwinson. Essentially, why should he have gone north to fight them? And the answer is probably yes, because he was king and he had to do something. So that had happened. This had happened. Now, just as he's won the battle, and Harold Hardrada is gone, dead, and only a handful of ships made the journey back because the rest of them were dead. Then the wind changes and William attacks the south. So Harold has to go down to Hastings, which is there, and fight against William after just having a battle against the Vikings. Some of the third had to go home. Harold didn't stop to pick up anymore, and he could have waited in London and he'd been safe. So he didn't do that, which is some people have said a mistake. But he did again. The Normans were like the Vikings had been, going crazy and causing havoc and destroying villages left, right, and centre. William was also building a fort, a castle, so he had to get there as quick as he can, he thought, and not stop for reinforcement. He's also pretty confident he just won a battle against the biggest, baddest Viking of all time, maybe. And so they get themselves in a good position on Senlac Hill, and then they lose. But why did they lose? Troops. William won because he had better troops. William won because they had better tactics. That doesn't mean the Saxons didn't have good tactics. They had some good tactics, but Williams were better and more flexible. Leadership and luck. So, oh, Oh, I've missed me troops. I've lost me troops. Oh, well, I'm gonna have to talk you through the troops then, aren't I? Without a slide to go on. Right. So essentially, the Saxons had the housecarls, um, some of which had been killed in the fighting against Hardrada, and the third, some of which had to go home, and some new third was sent. And the ones that were there were tired because they've been marching north and marching south for like previous few weeks. But the housecarls were very good fighters, fought on foot though. The third were less well armed and trained, but still half decent, especially if they were select third, which some of them were. But William had a varied array of troops. They had the knights on the horses. They had the foot soldiers, which were equal to the housecarls pretty much. They had archers, both crossbowmen and longbowmen, and so William had more things to use, more tactics that he could have used, which brings us on to tactics. Harold's tactics was basically make a shield wall at the top of the hill. The arrows won't be able to get to us because they're firing uphill. The knights won't be able to get through us because they're running uphill. And then if it comes to a fight between the foot soldiers and the housecarls, then it's as long as they stop them from getting through the shield wall, then they can stay there for all day and even another day. It's up to the Normans essentially to break through and get to London. William, though, changed his tactics. He changed them when he realised the archers didn't have much effect. He used his cavalry, but that wasn't working. So he came up with the famed retreat, where he'd noticed when the cavalry had been chasing up the hill that some of the third and the flanks, when they retreated because they're going to get through, chased after them, leaving the hole. So they weren't as well trained not to stay in the shield wall. So when the next time they went up, he said, just watch for that. If they chase after you when you retreat again, turn around and get through the hole. And it worked. And they got through the hole. And once you're through the hole in the shield wall, it's like putting a pin in a balloon. It's no use after that because you can get around the back. So William's leadership was good because he changed tactics, but also he was brave. He took his helmet off and showed his face in the middle of battle because people thought he was dead. So he's like, "No, don't worry, I'm still alive." Took his hat off. He probably said it in French. So, Harold, in contrast, was less good. He should have got more troop reinforcements. Although some people say that he should have actually been even quicker to get to Hastings. Either way, he tried to get there and take them by surprise. It worked against Harold Hardrada. It didn't work against William. William was ruthless. He'd been destroying towns to make sure that Harold had got there really quickly. He was organised. He built this castle that was pre-made. He was patient because he knew that Harold would have to get rid of the third. He was lucky, but we'll get onto that in a second. He kept his army together, which was difficult when he got like thousands of men. And he was ambitious and risked crossing the channel with a load of horses on boats, which was not done in those days. And then finally, luck. There's the luck of the wind changing just at the right time. If the wind changed a couple of weeks before, Harold wouldn't have had to fight the Vikings. If it changed a couple of weeks later, he'd have been able to get more reinforcements. So the timing was bad for Harold, but good for William. Then also within the battle, the fact that Harold got killed was just dumb luck. William took his helmet off. He could have had an arrow in the eye. Anything could have happened. Didn't happen to him, but did to Harold. So they're the 4 reasons, if you get a question on that. There's some more here if you want to have a go at that. Sorting them into William being good, Hal being bad, or luck, or tactics, troops, leadership and luck, which we've already been through. Well, go do it. But remember, if you got a question on what was the main reason or explain why William won, then you should do peel paragraphs. And there's an example of a strong paragraph on why Harold lost or why William won, because it's the same thing, really, isn't it? I've done that one already. Just as a postscript, Harold may or may not have died with an arrow in the eye. That's what the Bayeux Tapestry suggests. And there is another what's the word, account that does say that he did get stuck in the face with an arrow, but there's also accounts that said he was actually hacked to death. There you go, that's the one from William. Miles was saying he did get his brain pierced by an arrow, but that's written in 1125, and he'd probably already seen the Bayeux Tapestry then that suggested that was the case. So it might be that he's taken his information not from the battle, because he wasn't there, but from the Bayeux Tapestry itself. Anyway, that's it really for the first unit, and the dog hasn't come back for a week, so bonus, and I'm off to watch football. At the moment, Man City losing 1-0. So, see what happens. Ta-ra!